the 19 children who were locked in the Belfry of St. Patrick's and never released. In the year 1834, Dublin stood restless, torn between the weight of its poverty and the rigid hand of the church. At the center of the city, St. Patrick's Cathedral rose like a monument not only to God but to the power of those who claim to speak for him. Its spires cut through the gray Irish sky, its bells echoing across cobblestone streets, summoning the devout with tones that promised salvation. Yet to those who lingered long enough beneath its shadow, the tower seemed less a house of worship and more a prison, its stones heavy with secrets that no sermon could cleanse. The Belfry had always been a place of unease. Even among the clergy, narrow staircases wound upward through cold stone, leading to the chamber where massive bronze bells hung suspended like watchful eyes. The chamber smelled of iron and mildew, and the air carried a damp chill that clung to the skin. Parishioners rarely saw this place, but whispers surrounded it, rumors of strange noises heard at night, of soft knocks echoing from the beams, of birds refusing to roost in its rafters. To outsiders, the cathedral was a beacon of God's grace, yet within its highest tower something unholy stirred, and it watched in silence. The city's poor were told that the cathedral was their refuge, and for desperate families it was often their last hope. Children thin from hunger were brought there under the promise of learning letters, prayers, and trades. Mothers kissed their foreheads at the great wooden doors, believing they were giving their sons and daughters a future brighter than the smoke-filled streets. They never guessed that many of those children would never walk back into the light again. Each disappearance was explained away with careful words: illness, accidents, sometimes even a runaway child. Dublin was harsh and life was fragile. No one questioned too deeply when another small face vanished into the folds of poverty. But the truth was that the tower itself had become a collector of souls. Each stone step leading upward had felt the trembling of small feet. Each narrow corridor had echoed with the shallow breaths of children carried higher than they ever wished to climb. At the top, the bells did not only call the faithful. They rang to mask the sound of locks turning, of hands pounding against oak doors, of the first desperate cries swallowed by the clash of bronze. The tower was not merely a structure. It was a witness, a vessel, a silent accomplice to the unspeakable. Beneath the surface of piety, the cathedral harbored a mind obsessed not with faith but with silence itself. This mind understood that nothing in the city was more unnoticed than the suffering of the poor. It understood that the world accepted death as part of God's mysterious will, and it twisted that acceptance into a weapon. In the Belfry, silence was not absence. It was discipline. Children were not merely confined. They were broken into quiet submission, stripped of their voices until the walls absorbed every last whimper. Hunger, thirst, and fear became instruments of ritual. What began as charity transformed into something methodical. Something cold, something designed not only to kill but to erase. The bells themselves played their role. When they tolled, their vibration shook the beams where tiny hands clutched in despair. The bronze thunder drowned the pleading voices, erasing them beneath sacred sound. To the city below, the bells spoke of holy hours and divine order. To those trapped above, they were the roar of a beast that devoured every hope of being heard. The bells turned human agony into background noise, blending worship with death until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. And so the tower stood year after year, a silent predator cloaked in stone and scripture. Dublin grew accustomed to its presence, never questioning what the bells concealed. Families continued to send their children into the cathedral's embrace, unaware of the fate awaiting them above. No questions were asked because questions were dangerous, and faith demanded trust even when it burned the soul. The tower watched in silence, as it always had. It bore no expression, no judgment, no remorse. It only held what was placed inside it, sealing each life within its cold heart. For those who vanished, the Belfry became both cradle and coffin, a place where innocence was consumed not in fire or fury, but in quiet, ritualized starvation of body and spirit. The tower asked for nothing, and yet it demanded everything, one child at a time. And as the bells continued to toll over Dublin, no one realized that their call to worship was also a funeral song. The city knelt in prayer, never seeing that their cathedral had become a fortress of shadows. Within the Belfry, 19 small lives would soon vanish, one after another, each step of their suffering hidden behind the sound of sacred bronze. The tower kept its secrets, watching, waiting, listening, until silence itself became its truest prayer. Canon Edward Harrington was not the kind of man one would suspect. His presence inside St. Patrick's Cathedral seemed almost too gentle for the role he held. He spoke with a measured calm, never raising his voice, never letting anger cross his features. To the noble families who attended his sermons, he was a beacon of civility in a city drowned in poverty. They admired the way he extended his hand to the needy, offering bread at the steps of the cathedral, bowing his head as if humbled by service. The poor themselves looked upon him with gratitude, for when hunger clawed at their children, it was Harrington who filled their bowls. But behind this gentle mask lay a mind rehearsing a performance far darker than any sermon. Harrington believed in purity, but not in the way Scripture taught. To him, purity was not about grace, but about control, about reducing the chaos of human life to silence and stillness. In the privacy of his quarters, he wrote endlessly in journals that no one else was meant to see. These were not records of prayer, but blueprints of punishment. He described silence not as absence of sound, but as a state of perfection, a state where the soul was stripped of every worldly cry. He wrote that only through the disciplined removal of voice, of breath, even of heartbeat, could one approach God in his purest form. To the world, he was an innocent hand feeding the poor. In his mind, he was a craftsman shaping souls through cruelty. The more he fed children with bread, the more he thought of their bodies as vessels. He observed how they looked up at him, trusting, their lips wet with broth or milk he had provided, and he saw in their hunger an opening. In his mind, feeding them was not charity, but the first step in possession. He believed that when a child accepted food from his hand, they unknowingly entered a covenant, one that gave him the right to shape their destiny. His journals grew darker as he described how charity itself was an instrument, how kindness created dependence, and how dependence gave him the right to demand silence. Harrington's methods of discipline began with small tests. A child who spoke out of turn during lessons was forced to kneel for hours on cold stone, their voice silenced until obedience returned. Those who wept from hunger were denied food until their cries ceased. He would watch them closely, taking notes in his mind, calculating how long it took for each child to fall silent. Some required only hours, others endured days before their bodies surrendered. To Harrington, this was science disguised as scripture. Each child was a study, a subject in his experiment of silence. Their suffering was not an accident of poverty, but a deliberate act of ritual. When nobles and bishops visited, Harrington's mask remained unbroken. He guided them through the halls, showing children at prayer, speaking gently of the cathedral's mission to uplift the poor. They saw only order and devotion, never noticing the way some children's eyes appeared hollow, never hearing the way their voices trembled when they sang hymns. Harrington had perfected the art of hiding cruelty beneath ritual. He spoke of discipline as a gift, of obedience as the highest form of love. The more he convinced the powerful, the freer he became to continue his hidden work. Yet behind the calm, Harrington's obsession gnawed at him. He began to see the children not as individuals, but as instruments of his doctrine. When he closed his eyes at night, he imagined the cathedral filled with bodies frozen in silence, a congregation that would never speak, never resist, never corrupt purity with noise. His journals became more fevered, his words circling back to the idea that silence itself was divine music, that the absence of breath was the holiest hymn. The innocent hand that fed the poor was only a mask for the hand that dreamed of starving them. Each death he envisioned in his mind was methodical, rehearsed like liturgy. He wrote of sealing mouths not only with cloth but with wax, of binding limbs until they no longer twitched, of creating sacred spaces where suffering could be carried out unseen. He believed that silence achieved through pain was not cruelty but transformation, the purification of flawed flesh into holy quiet. Every act of feeding became to him a prelude to possession. Each bowl of bread was an invitation not to life but to a carefully measured death. And so the cathedral thrived under his leadership, admired by the faithful and protected by the powerful. No one questioned the canon whose hand fed the poor, whose voice soothed the nobles, whose sermons spoke of humility. But in the belfry above and in the journals locked within his desk, the truth grew clearer with every page. Harrington's kindness was only bait. His devotion was only disguise. His innocence was the mask of a predator who believed silence itself was the truest form of prayer. The city below rang with the sound of bells calling the devout to worship. But in Harrington's mind, each toll was another reminder of what must come. The bells were not voices of faith. They were instruments waiting to drown out the cries of those who would soon be silenced forever. The boy was 7 years old, nameless to the city but not to Canon Harrington. His parents had died in the fever that swept through Dublin's poorest districts, leaving him thin, barefoot, and begging near the cathedral steps. Harrington noticed him one cold morning as he pressed his hands against the stone wall for warmth. To anyone else, the boy was another orphan swallowed by the misery of the streets. To Harrington, he was a vessel, a willing lamb to be led toward silence. With a soft smile and a gentle hand on the child's shoulder, Harrington promised bread, warmth, and schooling. It was the oldest form of temptation cloaked in charity, and the boy followed without hesitation. The first days were made to feel like kindness. The boy was bathed, fed until his belly hurt, clothed in garments far too large for his thin frame. He slept in a bed softer than any he had known. and for a time he believed he had been rescued. Harrington watched him closely, recording every expression of gratitude, every shy smile, every whispered prayer before sleep. In his journals, he described the child as pliant, grateful, and most importantly, silent when commanded. The feeding was not mere generosity but preparation. Harrington's ritual always began with fullness, with the illusion of safety, because the deeper the trust, the sharper the cruelty when it was finally revealed. It was late one night when the first true descent began. Harrington led the boy by the hand up the narrow staircase of the Belfry. The air grew colder with each step. The shadows lengthened, and the boy's breathing quickened in nervous rhythm. At the top, the bells loomed like watchful giants, their great bodies suspended above the dark chamber. Harrington lit a single candle, its small flame flickering against the stone walls, and told the boy that prayer in this holy place was special, that silence here meant God was listening more closely. The boy obeyed, kneeling on the cold floor, folding his hands as he had been taught. But Harrington's devotion was not to God. It was to silence itself, and tonight he would attempt his first true sacrifice. With deliberate movements, he bound the boy's ankles with coarse rope and hoisted him upside down from one of the beams, letting his small body dangle like a pendulum. At first the boy laughed nervously, thinking it a strange game, but when his head throbbed and blood filled his ears, the laughter turned to cries. Harrington's expression never changed. He took the candle in his hand and tilted it over a pewter bowl, letting hot wax drip and harden. He whispered to himself that wax was the perfect seal, born from fire, meant to quiet the flesh. The ritual was slow. Harrington forced the boy's mouth open with a wooden wedge and poured softened wax between his lips. The child gagged, choking as the substance cooled and hardened against his tongue and throat. His muffled screams echoed faintly, but Harrington had chosen the bells wisely. With a tug of the rope, he swung the boy's body just enough to make the clappers strike bronze, and the chamber filled with a deafening toll. The cries were swallowed, disguised as nothing more than the holy call to prayer. The sound reverberated through the cathedral walls, shaking the city below, and no one realized they were listening to a child's death masked as worship. Harrington observed carefully, taking note of how long the boy's body struggled before fatigue overcame him. He described in his journal the twitching of limbs, the rolling of eyes, the final slackness that meant silence had at last been achieved. He did not see the boy as a victim, but as a subject who had been perfected through suffering. When the body finally hung still, Harrington did not weep or pray for forgiveness. Instead, he carefully lowered the child, arranging him on the cold stone floor as if he were only asleep. By morning, the death had been explained away with practiced ease. Harrington told the clergy that the boy had fallen ill in the night, his frail body unable to survive the fever that plagued so many orphans. The explanation was accepted without suspicion. Orphan children died often. Their deaths did not stir alarm. A small burial was arranged in unconsecrated ground, and the matter was quickly forgotten by the church and the city. But for Harrington, the event was unforgettable. He had proven his method. He had transformed noise into silence, chaos into order. He had discovered a ritual that satisfied both his obsession and his belief in purity. Yet even as he buried the body, Harrington's mind had already turned toward the future. He wrote of the boy not as a child but as a prototype, the first note in what he called a symphony of silence. He described the wax as divine sealant, the bell's toll as the perfect mask, the upside-down body as a symbol of humility before God. Each detail mattered, each step carried significance. He was not improvising cruelty, he was building a doctrine, a ritual that would grow stronger with each life he claimed. The city remained blind. Mothers still brought their children to the cathedral, grateful for the food and clothing. Clergy still praised Harrington for his gentle hand and patient teaching. No one saw that beneath the soft smile was a mind rehearsing death, refining cruelty into ceremony. The first taken boy was buried in silence, his name erased from memory. But Harrington carried him as a victory, a necessary step toward the greater work. The ritual had begun, and the Belfry would not rest until its silence was complete. The first boy's death had not satisfied Harrington's obsession. It had only confirmed what he had long believed. That silence could be manufactured, carved into a body like scripture etched into stone. From that moment, his mind began to arrange children in his thoughts the way a composer arranges notes in a score. Each disappearance became another verse in his hymn, each ritualized death another step toward what he described in his journals as a cathedral of silence, built not with brick but with breath withheld forever. Over the years, 18 more children passed through his hands, each chosen with care. He selected the youngest and weakest, those least likely to be missed, yet always under the pretense of kindness. Mothers still wept with gratitude when Harrington placed bread in their children's hands, never imagining that the same hand would later force those same mouths shut. The city saw generosity, but within the Belfry, Harrington saw opportunity. His methods grew more precise, each ritual designed with chilling attention to detail. One child, a girl of 8 with a clear singing voice, was placed inside a wooden chest lined with cloth to muffle sound. As she beat against the lid and screamed for release, Harrington pulled the ropes that set the great bells in motion. The toll shook the chamber, drowning her cries beneath waves of sacred thunder. He recorded the experiment carefully, noting how long the body could endure before the struggle stilled. To him it was not murder but the perfect harmony of worship, the bell above, the silence below. Another child, a boy who had resisted prayer and whispered doubts about the cathedral, was punished with water. Harrington forced him to kneel in a shallow basin filled with icy water drawn from the cathedral's cisterns. Psalms were read aloud as the boy remained locked in place, his knees swelling, his body shivering until exhaustion pulled him down. Harrington watched without pity, convinced that the pain was not cruelty but purification. When the child's body finally went limp, face half submerged, Harrington marked the moment in his journal as the baptism of silence. Each death followed this same ritual rhythm. No act was impulsive, no cruelty wasted. Children were suspended by ropes until their cries became nothing but hoarse gasps, or they were bound in darkness for days until silence came as the final answer. Harrington justified every method with scripture twisted into new meanings. He wrote of silence as prayer, suffering as obedience, death as the sealing of purity. In his eyes, he was not ending lives, he was perfecting them. What haunted the chamber most was not only the suffering of the children, but the order with which it was carried out. Harrington left no detail to chance. He timed deaths to coincide with bell tolls, so no cry would ever reach the city below. He placed bodies in positions that mirrored acts of worship, kneeling, arms crossed, heads bowed. He called these positions postures of silence. Each body became to him a sacred offering, a statue of devotion sculpted through torment. The toll this ritual exacted upon Harrington's mind was not seen as madness by him, but as clarity. The more children vanished, the more convinced he became that he was serving something higher than himself. He saw patterns in their deaths, numbers and symbols aligning like divine instruction. He began to speak in his journals of 19 children as the perfect measure, a number that would complete the cycle of silence and seal the cathedral forever. Each child lost was not tragedy but progress toward this final goal. Yet beneath his calm mask, something darker gnawed at him. Harrington began to hear echoes in the tower when no bells were ringing. At night he imagined small fists still pounding against wooden lids, voices crying out beneath the roar of bronze. Instead of frightening him, these echoes comforted him. He told himself they were not the screams of the dead, but the whispers of souls thanking him for their purification. The more he heard them, the more certain he became that he was not a monster, but a prophet of silence. Outside the cathedral, suspicion grew faintly. Parishioners noticed that certain children never returned home. Mothers whispered in markets about boys and girls who vanished after entering St. Patrick's. Yet the city was too burdened with its own misery to look too closely. Children died often, and priests were trusted more than grieving families. When questions reached Harrington, he responded with a lowered gaze, speaking of illness, of runaway orphans, of the dangers of the streets. His soft words silenced doubts as easily as he silenced children in the Belfry, and so the pattern grew. One death folding into another like verses of a hymn. 18 children after the first had followed the same path. Fed with kindness, taken with care, destroyed with method. Each death left Harrington both emptied and fulfilled, haunted and exalted. His journals became denser, filled with diagrams of bodies, symbols drawn from scripture, and calculations of endurance. He wrote not as a madman, but as a scholar, building a doctrine of suffering that only he understood. The city continued to bow beneath the sound of the cathedral bells, never knowing that each toll carried more than holy command. Beneath their vibration lay the muffled cries of 19 small souls woven into silence one by one. Harrington's pattern was nearly complete, and with each passing year the belfry itself grew heavier with the weight of secrets that no prayer could ever cleanse. The deaths had begun as experiments in silence, but Harrington's mind was restless. Each extinguished voice deepened his obsession, and soon he found silence itself no longer enough. What stirred in him was not satisfaction but hunger. He began to imagine not only the quieting of voices but their transformation into something else, a twisted form of music that no living congregation could ever produce. If silence was perfection, then song, he believed, must be reshaped into its mirror, a hymn not of praise but of mutilation. It began with bones. In the still hours of night, Harrington dissected the bodies of those who had fallen to his rituals. not with the eyes of a butcher but with the fascination of a craftsman. He found that ribs once stripped of flesh created natural hollows. When wires of drawn metal were strung across them, they hummed faintly when plucked. The sound was weak, but to Harrington it was divine. He described in his journals the rib cage as a harp of God's design, a sacred structure wasted in ordinary flesh but perfected once the living voice had been removed. From there his rituals shifted. No longer content with starvation, drowning, or wax, he devised new deaths that would leave behind instruments for his choir. He forced a girl of 10 to kneel while he pierced her throat with a narrow reed, not deep enough to kill her instantly, but enough to make her voice whistle in ragged gasps. She lived for hours, forced to recite prayers until her cries became shrill notes, breaking into unnatural tones that Harrington called psalms of air. When her body gave out, he preserved the reed, embedding it into bone so that the sound could be repeated whenever he wished. Another child was kept alive long enough to feel his transformation. Harrington bound him upright, opening his chest with cruel precision, and stretched wires across his ribcage while the boy's heart still beat beneath. Every movement caused the wires to tremble, releasing faint vibrations that Harrington interpreted as holy resonance. He recorded every shiver, noting how the tones deepened when the lungs emptied, how the music ceased only when the final breath left the body. To him, this was proof. Suffering itself could be made into song, and death could be arranged like liturgy. Over time, the chamber filled not only with bodies but with instruments of horror. Rib cages lined with wires, femurs carved into flutes, teeth drilled into tiny rattles. Harrington forced surviving children to perform with these objects, their trembling hands plucking strings made of gut, their mutilated throats pressed into unnatural notes. He called them his choir, a chorus born not of joy but of despair. And in the stillness of the belfry he conducted them like a priest leading hymns. Their cries, broken and hollow, blended with the resonance of bone until the chamber itself seemed alive with unholy music. The choir was never meant to be heard by the faithful below. The bells drowned it, their thunder masking the grotesque concert that unfolded above. But Harrington convinced himself that God heard it, that heaven received these sounds as proof of devotion. He wrote that true worship is not given by choice but carved into flesh, drawn out in wires and breath until no error remains. The choir of hollow mouths was, in his eyes, the closest he had come to divine order. Yet the children who lived long enough to sing bore the deepest scars. Some had their tongues cut so that only moans escaped. Others had reeds embedded in their throats so their breathing became eternal whistling. They were not allowed to rest until their bodies failed, and Harrington watched with fascination as they collapsed, their deaths folding seamlessly into his growing collection of instruments. For him, their suffering was not cruelty but confirmation. He was shaping them into a chorus that would outlast flesh, a harmony of silence and song that no mortal ear could understand. The psychological toll on Harrington himself was strange. The more twisted his creations became, the calmer his demeanor grew. To those outside the belfry, he seemed even gentler, even more devoted to the poor. He walked among them with the serenity of a saint, handing out bread and blessings, his eyes shining with what they thought was kindness. But inside, every smile was fueled by the memory of children's voices bent into song, by the satisfaction of having turned suffering into order. The contrast between his mask and his madness only deepened his belief that he was chosen, that he alone carried out a divine task hidden beneath ordinary charity. And so the Belfry became both sanctuary and stage. The bells tolled as they always had, but behind their roar, Harrington's choir played on. Rib cages hummed, reeds whistled, throats moaned in broken hymns. It was a concert unseen, unheard, yet relentless, each note carved from torment, each sound preserved in death. To the world, St. Patrick's Cathedral stood as a beacon of worship. But within its tower, beauty cloaked a grotesque orchestra, a choir of hollow mouths raised not in praise of God, but in worship of silence itself. By the time the number of vanished, children had climbed past a dozen. Whispers began to coil through Dublin's narrow streets. Mothers who once praised Harrington now clutched their rosaries tighter when his name was spoken. Fathers who had watched their sons walk through the cathedral doors with pride began to feel the ache of doubt when they never returned. Markets grew tense with quiet speculation, women leaning close over baskets of bread to murmur about orphans who entered St. Patrick's but were never seen again. But fear of the church stifled voices, for who dared accuse a man who carried the holy vestments of God? A few parents found the courage to complain. They knocked on the cathedral gates, demanding answers, their grief breaking through their poverty-shamed silence. They asked where their children had gone, why no bodies had been returned, why the city seemed to accept their absence as if it were nothing more than God's will. Harrington himself met them at times, his face calm, his hands folded in solemnity. He spoke softly of illness, of fevers that struck without warning, of children who ran to other towns or ships seeking work. His tone carried such conviction that even the angriest found their rage blunted, as though arguing against him was arguing against God himself. And so they left, empty-handed and ashamed, believing their grief must be borne in silence. Yet not all remained quiet. A group of desperate families, sensing something monstrous behind the cathedral's walls, managed to draft letters to London addressed to the advisors of King William IV. They pleaded for an inquiry naming Canon Edward Harrington and his strange obsession with taking children into his care. The letters were desperate and raw, filled with the sorrow of the poor, their handwriting uneven, their words marked by trembling hands. They believed that if the king knew, justice would follow. But justice never came. The letters never stirred action, for they never left the quiet corridors of power. Advisors read them, weighed their content against the reputation of the Church of Ireland, and decided that the dignity of the clergy outweighed the suffering of peasants. To cast suspicion on a man of God would cause scandal, would weaken the already fragile bond between crown and church. So the pleas were silenced, hidden beneath layers of official ceremony, filed away as though the grief of parents was nothing more than a dangerous rumor. The weight of power pressed the cries of the poor into the dirt, ensuring no stain touched the silk of bishops or the crown itself. Inside St. Patrick's, Harrington sensed the unrest, but was never disturbed. He knew how well the church would protect him, how deeply the system favored silence over scandal. His face remained a mask of devotion, his hands continuing to feed the poor, his voice steady as ever from the pulpit. But in the shadows of the belfry, his rituals grew bolder. Each protest from a grieving parent only deepened his conviction, for if no authority punished him, then surely his work must be sanctioned by heaven. The lack of consequence became his proof of divine favor. He believed the crown itself had, by silence, blessed his choir of death. What the city saw was a contradiction they dared not name. Funerals were held for children whose bodies had never been returned. Priests spoke of God's mysterious ways, of illness that took the young, of heaven filling with angels. Families stood in black, listening to hollow words while their hearts screamed for truth. Yet grief was buried under ritual, tears drowned by hymns, suspicions muffled by the weight of the cathedral bells. And so evil hid in plain sight, draped not in shadows, but in silk robes and royal connections. Harrington walked freely among the people, his reputation unshaken, his power unchallenged. His face appeared saintly, his hands charitable, his voice unassailable. Beneath it all, he carried the memory of 19 children whose cries had been turned into instruments, whose silence was mistaken for obedience. The city learned to swallow its grief, and those who once whispered grew quiet again, their suspicions eroded by fear. Society itself became complicit, for every bowed head in prayer, every acceptance of ritual over truth, allowed Harrington's rituals to continue. The bells tolled as they always had, yet beneath their roar lay something darker. The knowledge that the church and crown had chosen dignity over innocence, silence over justice, ritual over life. It was on a damp evening when the fog rolled heavy across Dublin's cobblestones that Harrington enacted what he believed to be the culmination of his work. The Belfry had claimed many lives before, each one methodical, each one bound in ritual, but now his journal spoke of completion. 19 was the number, 19 the measure of divine symmetry. He called them his psalm, a living chorus that would ascend together and forever belong to silence. The cathedral tower, so long a stage for individual deaths, was to become their collective tomb. He gathered the last of the children with the same calm hands that once gave bread, leading them by lamplight through the winding stairs that curled up into darkness. Their faces were pale, their trust fractured. For by now even the youngest sensed that entering the Belfry meant vanishing. Yet fear had no voice in them. Their obedience had been beaten into silence through months of ritual. Harrington carried no whip, no chains, only his authority, which was enough to herd them upward into the chamber where the bells waited like patient executioners. Once inside, the door was bolted. 19 children huddled in the shadows, their thin forms trembling, their eyes darting toward the giant bronze shapes looming above. Harrington stood among them with a composure that bordered on serenity. He told himself this was not murder but offering, that their collective suffering would rise like incense to the heavens. He declared them a psalm, living instruments of devotion, and with those words he extinguished the last flicker of light, leaving the chamber in suffocating blackness. What followed was slow and deliberate. He denied them food, denied them water, denied them the comfort of light. He sat below in the nave of the cathedral, head bowed in prayer, listening as the cries began above. At first there were voices raised in pleading, small fists pounding against oak doors, the sound of many feet scuffling in panic. Then the cries grew thinner, breaking into whimpers, followed by fits of coughing as the air thickened with the stench of unwashed bodies. Harrington recorded it all, counting the hours, timing the intervals between outbursts. To him, each stage of their suffering was a verse, each weakening cry another step in the sacred liturgy of silence. Days passed, though the cathedral clocks made the passage of time feel like an endless hymn. From the belfry came the sounds of children tearing at the wood with fingernails, scratching until their hands bled. The marks of their desperation etched themselves into the beams, a testament of resistance that Harrington viewed as nothing more than noise being carved away. Hunger hollowed their voices, thirst turned their tongues to ash, and soon the cries dwindled into faint scratching, as if the very bones of the tower had begun to groan. One by one the voices fell quiet. Some collapsed where they stood, their small bodies slumping into stillness. Others clawed their way into the rafters, wedging themselves among beams in futile attempts to escape. It was there that many breathed their last, hidden in shadow, their ribs protruding like broken instruments. Harrington entered occasionally, not to comfort, but to observe. He walked among their weakening bodies with detached fascination, tilting his head as if studying notes on a page. He whispered prayers, but they were not for mercy. They were for precision, for the perfect unfolding of silence he had so long awaited. By the time the last voice fell silent, the chamber had transformed into a grotesque reliquary. Bodies dangled from beams where children had tried to climb, their fingers still clutching at ropes and rafters. Others lay twisted on the floor, mouths frozen open as if still trying to cry out. The air was heavy with decay, yet to Harrington it was holy, filled not with the smell of death but the incense of sacrifice. He arranged the bodies with deliberate care, ensuring they faced the bells, ensuring their final posture was one of forced devotion. From below, the cathedral remained untouched, its marble floors gleaming, its altars adorned with flowers. Parishioners still gathered for prayer, their voices rising in hymns, never suspecting that above their heads 19 children had become the true chorus of St. Patrick's. Harrington moved among them with serenity, feeding the poor at the gates, delivering sermons with gentle authority, his mask intact. No one saw the shadow he carried, no one heard the echoes that haunted the tower. The belfry was sealed, its door bolted, its cries forever absorbed into stone and wood. The tower had always been silent, but now it was complete. It held not only secrets but relics, 19 small bodies suspended in eternal devotion, a psalm written in flesh and preserved in darkness. To Harrington, it was his greatest work, the fulfillment of his doctrine. To the city below, it was nothing more than the toll of bells, calling them to worship as it always had. The cathedral's beauty cloaked its most grotesque truth, and the belfry waited, sealed, watching in silence as Dublin prayed beneath it. It ended not with a scandal uncovered by men, but with Harrington's own body collapsing in the middle of the very ceremony he had so often used to disguise his cruelty. It was a Sunday morning, the nave full of worshippers, the choir of boys and girls singing psalms that rang beneath the vaulted ceiling. Harrington stood at the pulpit, hands folded across scripture, voice steady as he spoke of obedience and the peace of God's silence. But as he raised his hand in blessing, his lips froze, his chest seized, and he fell backward, striking the marble floor with a sound that echoed like the crack of a bell. Panic rippled through the congregation, but the canon was gone before a doctor could be fetched. His death was swift, his heart stopped, and the man who had so carefully controlled the silence of others was himself silenced without warning. In the days that followed, the cathedral mourned. Bishops and nobles gathered, praising his charity, his patience, his steady devotion to the poor. The city whispered of grief and loss, never daring to consider relief. But that night, long after his body had been taken to the crypt, the bells rang. They did not toll at the hand of any man, for no one had touched the ropes. Workers sleeping in the cloisters awoke to the sound, a low and hollow thunder that rolled across Dublin, shaking windows, startling birds into the air. The bells rang without pause, their tones uneven, as though the tower itself groaned with pain. None dared climb the stairs that night. The cathedral was locked, but the bells continued until dawn, when suddenly they fell silent. By morning, whispers ran through the city that Harrington's death had awakened something in the tower. The clergy tried to explain it as a fault in the ropes, a trick of the wind, but fear began to gnaw at the faithful. At last, a group of workers was sent to investigate, carrying lanterns and tools, their steps slow and uneasy as they climbed the winding staircase. The higher they went, the heavier the air became, filled with the scent of decay hidden for too long. When they reached the chamber, their lanterns revealed not emptiness but a grotesque secret sealed for years. The belfry was thick with shadows, and in those shadows were bones. They hung from the ropes in tangled clusters, skeletal arms draped across beams. Skulls tilted toward the bells as though still listening for sound. Some bodies had fallen into the rafters, wedged between planks. Their teeth sunk deep into the wood where they had gnawed in desperation. Others lay crumpled on the floor, their ribs collapsed inward, their hands clawing at the stone. The ropes themselves were frayed and stiff with remnants of flesh, as if the bells had been fed not with oil, but with human suffering. The workers froze, their lantern light flickering across the chamber. For a long moment none could speak, for to name what they saw was to admit that the cathedral itself had been a tomb. The silence of the dead pressed against them, heavy and suffocating. Then one man dropped his lantern in shock, the flame spilling across the floor, and the chamber came alive in an orange glow that revealed horrors more deliberate still. The bones were not scattered at random, they had been arranged. Along the beams were rib cages aligned in rows, their hollow shapes forming crude symbols that mirrored crosses and circles drawn from liturgy. Jawbones had been set like ornaments, teeth still intact, forming grim halos around the bells. In one corner, skulls had been stacked in a pyramid, their sockets facing outward as if forced into eternal congregation. This was not chaos, it was order, a careful arrangement left by Harrington as proof of his devotion. Each child's body had been transformed into relic, each death a piece of his doctrine carved into the very architecture of the tower. The workers, trembling, tried to descend, but the bells stirred again. Without any hand upon them, the ropes quivered, the clappers struck bronze, and the chamber shook with a sound that drove men to their knees. The bells groaned with a resonance that seemed alive, as though the weight of the dead had seeped into their very metal. Some swore afterward that the tones were not pure but fractured, layered with faint echoes of screams buried within. Others claimed they heard scratching, the desperate clawing of nails still embedded in wood, woven into the thunder of bronze. Whatever the truth, none left the chamber unchanged. Word of the discovery spread quickly, though never fully. The church moved fast, ordering silence, forbidding workers to speak. Bodies were removed quietly under cover of darkness, carried not in processions but in sacks, disposed of with no names, no prayers, no markers. The clergy wrote reports that blamed famine, disease, the accidents of children seeking play in forbidden places. Official words buried the horror, yet the city knew. Rumors spread faster than truth. Stories of children locked in the Belfry, their bodies gnawed and arranged into unholy shrines. Parents who had once prayed for their missing sons and daughters now wept with certainty that their cries had been swallowed by the bells. The cathedral remained open, its altars gleaming, its sermons uninterrupted. Bishops preached more fervently than ever, their words laced with warnings about obedience, as though louder prayers could drown the stain of the past. But the people's faith was shaken. Some still knelt at the pews, clinging to ritual out of fear. Others avoided the cathedral altogether, unwilling to look at the tower that had swallowed so many. And when the bells rang at holy hours, many covered their ears, unable to hear them without imagining the small mouths silenced within. For all its beauty, the cathedral could never shed what was uncovered. The bones had been taken, the chamber scrubbed, the ropes replaced, but the marks remained, scratches in wood, teeth embedded in beams, grooves carved by fingernails. They could not be hidden, for the tower itself had absorbed the suffering. And when the bells rang, their tones carried a weight no cleaning could erase. Dublin heard them differently now, not as a call to worship, but as a reminder of the price of silence. The fall of the innocent bells was not an event that ended, but one that lingered. The city carried it like a wound, unspoken yet unhealed. Families avoided the subject. Children were warned never to linger near the cathedral, and yet the tower still stood, its stones heavy with secrets. No one dared speak the full horror aloud, for to do so was to admit that faith itself had been a mask for cruelty. And so the truth lived on, not in sermons or records, but in the toll of the bells, each strike a grim echo of the 19 children who had been sealed within and transformed into silence. The discovery inside the Belfry spread like smoke, curling first through Dublin's streets and then drifting across the sea into the halls of England. What the workers saw could not be erased, and though the church tried to smother the scandal, silence could not hold against the weight of 19 small bodies. In taverns, markets, and alleyways, whispers carried the truth. That Canon Harrington had locked children away, that the bells themselves had drowned their cries, that bones had been arranged like scripture above the heads of the faithful. For every denial from the pulpit, 100 retellings bloomed in the shadows, each more vivid than the last. Yet the scandal was not met with compassion. It was met with fear. The crown and clergy alike saw not the children's suffering, but the danger of exposure, the risk that faith itself might fracture under the weight of such revelations. To admit the truth would mean admitting that the church had sheltered a predator, that the crown had ignored the cries of the poor, that power had chosen dignity over innocence. So measures were taken not to protect children but to protect institutions. Families of the vanished were quietly summoned one by one to dimly lit rooms where bishops and lawyers sat with purses of coin. They were offered pensions, small payments delivered each month, on the condition that their voices, remained silent. Papers were drawn up, signed with trembling hands, binding grief into secrecy. Mothers who wanted to scream their children's names from the cathedral steps found themselves muzzled by the promise of food for the siblings left behind. Fathers who burned with rage swallowed it, knowing a protest would bring no justice, only starvation. And so silence was purchased, the same silence Harrington had built his doctrine upon, now weaponized by the very powers that had once shielded him. But silence cannot erase memory. Survivors of other institutions began to whisper. They spoke of orphanages where children were beaten until they could no longer cry, of charity homes where food was withheld as punishment, of schools where voices were silenced in the name of discipline. Harrington was not an isolated monster, but part of a system that thrived on obedience and quiet suffering. His Belfry was only the most grotesque expression of a belief that had long existed, that the poor, the orphaned, the voiceless could be shaped into silence without consequence. The Crown, unsettled by the spread of rumor, acted not out of mercy but necessity. Laws were drafted on child welfare and the management of orphanages, presented as moral progress but rooted in fear. Inspectors were appointed, though many looked the other way. Rules were written about food, housing, and discipline, but they were thin veils, easily torn aside when authority wished. The intent was not to protect children, but to protect reputations, to ensure another Harrington would never stain the dignity of church or state. These laws were monuments not to innocence, but to image, carved from fear rather than compassion. In the decades that followed, monuments did rise. Across Ireland, small statues and plaques appeared to honor the lost children, though never did they name St. Patrick's Belfry. The cathedral remained untouched, its spire still slicing the sky, its bells still tolling as though they had never swallowed cries. Visitors prayed beneath its vaulted ceiling, tourists marveled at its history, and only in hushed tones did locals mention what had been discovered above. The monuments were distant, symbolic, deliberately vague. They remembered children in general, not the 19 who had been sealed into silence. Their legacy was abstract, their names erased, their suffering turned into a cautionary tale too dangerous to speak plainly. But in the homes of the poor, the memory remained sharp. Mothers carried the scars of signing those papers. Fathers carried the guilt of taking those coins. They knew their children's voices had been traded for survival, their grief bound by the same silence Harrington had worshipped. Generations grew up with the story whispered like a curse. Children warned never to trust charity, never to walk too freely into the hands of those who claimed holiness. Fear became inheritance, distrust the only protection left. What haunted society most was not only the horror of what Harrington had done, but how close it came to being buried forever. If not for his sudden death, if not for the restless bells, the belfry might have remained sealed, the bones hidden, the truth erased beneath centuries of ritual. Evil had thrived in plain sight, wrapped in silk robes and spoken in a gentle voice, and nearly no one had dared question it. That realization spread wider than any rumor, infecting even those who had never stepped foot in Dublin. The church tried to draw a line between Harrington and itself, calling him an aberration, a sickness, a man whose sins should not stain the cloth. But the system that had sheltered him, the bishops who ignored complaints, the crown that buried letters, These could not be so easily absolved. Even in silence, people recognized complicity. Every toll of the bells reminded Dublin that obedience had been valued more than life, that silence had been chosen again and again over truth. The legacy of sealed mouths was not only the deaths of 19 children, but the lesson it carved into society. That evil is strongest when hidden beneath respectability. When silence is bought, when institutions protect themselves at the cost of the innocent. The city learned to live with that knowledge like a wound that never healed, a scar passed from parent to child, whisper to whisper. And still, the bells tolled, their sound carrying across cobblestones and rooftops, calling the faithful to prayer as though nothing had ever happened. Yet for those who remembered, each strike was a cruel echo, a reminder of mouths forced shut, of cries erased, of children who had been turned into relics of silence. Their voices were gone, but their absence was louder than any hymn. When Harrington's body fell lifeless in the cathedral, there were no whispers of judgment, no public cries of relief. To the end, he was remembered by most as a man of gentle words, a shepherd to the poor, a saintly figure who had given bread to hungry mouths. His crimes, uncovered in the Belfry, were never fully spoken aloud. They were contained, sealed again by the same forces that had allowed them to grow. The church, the crown, and the willingness of society to choose silence over confrontation. The evil he embodied was not merely his own madness. It was the reflection of a world that preferred dignity to truth, ritual to justice, appearance to suffering. The shape of his cruelty was methodical, but its true power came from how easily it blended into respectability. Harrington did not appear as a monster. He did not strike fear with wildness or brutality. He offered bread, spoke softly, and prayed with sincerity. His violence was hidden in discipline, framed as piety, concealed behind the robes of holiness. The people could not see it because they did not want to see it. Parents convinced themselves their children had been taken by illness. Bishops convinced themselves that suspicion was dangerous. Advisors convinced themselves that truth would weaken the crown. And so, silence spread like disease, protecting evil as surely as walls protect a fortress. Each child's death had been devastating, each one a ritual of torment staged in the shadows, yet no single death was enough to pierce the armor of denial. What gave Harrington his strength was not only his own obsession, but the indifference of those around him. Evil does not need an army to thrive. It needs only silence, the turning of heads, the refusal to listen. The parents who accepted coins in exchange for their grief became part of the silence. The priests who praised Harrington's charity became part of the silence. Even the city itself, bowing beneath the toll of the bells while children were being starved above, became part of the silence. Evil thrived not in the shadows but in plain sight because no one dared to break the quiet. The torture Harrington inflicted was not only upon the children, it extended to those who lived afterward, those who realized too late what had been done. Mothers carried the knowledge that their silence had cost their sons and daughters their lives. Fathers carried the weight of coins that bought food but erased names. Workers who had climbed the tower and seen the bones could never sleep without hearing the faint scratching of nails still buried in wood. The cathedral itself was haunted, not by ghosts but by memory, by the marks etched into its beams and the sound of bells that now rang with suspicion. torture lived on in the minds of the living, not only in the suffering of the dead. Harrington's journals, when later uncovered, revealed not the ramblings of a madman, but the writings of a man who believed his cruelty was sacred. His methods were precise, deliberate, disguised as liturgy. He wrote of silence as if it were salvation, of suffering as if it were purification, of death as if it were obedience. He had convinced himself that every child silenced was a hymn perfected. What made him monstrous was not chaos but order, not rage but calm calculation. His crimes were not bursts of violence but rehearsed ceremonies, each step recorded, each death an act of worship in his private doctrine. He was never out of control. He was methodically in control, and that made him far more terrifying than madness ever could. In the end, the city chose not to remember him as a killer. His name was never carved into monuments, never linked openly to the scandal. The children's deaths were left unspoken, their bones hidden again in unmarked ground. Their memory dissolved into whispers. But silence has a way of echoing louder than any confession. Every time the cathedral bells rang, the people heard more than bronze. They heard the cries that had been buried beneath, the psalms of silence Harrington had forced upon 19 small souls. The bells themselves became accomplices, forever carrying the weight of what had been concealed. The story of Harrington was never about one man. It was about what happens when silence becomes the language of power. Evil does not always arrive with blood on its hands. Sometimes it arrives with a gentle voice, with charity in its palm, with sermons that soothe rather than disturb. It thrives where communities refuse to see, where institutions protect themselves, where truth is too dangerous to speak. That was Harrington's greatest disguise, not his robes, not his prayers, but the silence that shielded him. As years turned into decades, his name faded, but the legacy remained. Laws were written, memorials erected, reforms promised, yet even these were rooted in fear of scandal rather than compassion for the dead. The true legacy was more haunting, the knowledge that evil can wear the face of innocence, and that silence will always be its most loyal servant. And now the question lingers like a wound that will not close. Could it happen again? Could another Harrington exist, hidden within the folds of respectability, sheltered by silence, shielded by trust? The answer lies not in the past, but in the present. For every institution that buries its scandals, for every parent silenced by shame, for every community that turns away from what it does not wish to see, the shape of Harrington lives on. Evil in the shape of silence is not gone. It waits, patient and methodical, behind masks of kindness, ready to grow wherever no one dares to speak.